how do I get from, let's say, a centralized small group of people, a BDFL or benevolent dictator for life, or even a company. If I'm taking a company and I'm transitioning to some kind of open source or some sort of community-owned project, how much does that process cost? So what exactly is to community? As I said, it's about transitioning a given project to governance by a community. And project can mean a lot of different things in this case. So I think I said company. So this is in cases what we call, Nathan Schneider introduced in 2019, this idea of exit to community. So anytime you might be considering an IPO or a private acquisition, you can instead think, oh, how could I sell this? How can I sell my company? How can I have this liquidity event where I'm bringing together a set of stakeholders, including employees, management, but also users, into the governance, into the ownership of my company? How can I align myself with my community? You might be thinking about closed source software. So I'll give you some more examples later. But this is maybe like, Google has a big piece of software, or IBM. Is Brian still here? He's out there, but I was going to put him on the spot because like he actually has governed one of these things. A lot of big companies, big corporations take closed source software projects and then figure out, how do I move it? And one of the principal ways, actually in the US at least, is they send it to the Linux Foundation, if you were here for Brian's talk. Open source software, you might already have a piece of open source software, but maybe it's maintained by one person, like most open source projects, or like at most like 2 to 3. How do I bring that up to a wider community? How do I open that up? How do I attract more users? How do I manage those users? That's a huge management process that takes time and effort, and honestly, like developers are generally not very good at it. And also, it's just maybe you're in Web3 and you have a DAO, but actually that DAO is not very decentralized. How do you actually decentralize this? And who's trying to do it? I was actually going to put a bunch of logos up here, but then I realized I didn't have to because they're already here. We got we got Near, we got Optimism, we got Drips. So that's I forget what was the radical, right? Octant. Everybody's trying to kind of exit or decentralize, progressively decentralize. And it's not just everybody here. A lot, as I mentioned, a lot of large, traditional corporations are also trying to do something along these lines. And they're doing it for lots of different reasons. So, standard reasons around security is sustainability. If you're an open source project, you want to sort of like obviously bring in additional people, additional contributors. Actually, some of the questions revolve around scalability or even competition. Why did Google release Kubernetes? Wasn't necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts, though. It actually is arguable that part of it was. Part of it was this idea that like how do we compete with the giant market leader called AWS? There's a lot of reasons that go into these considerations, and a lot of money actually. A big question, and this is something that's apparent both for the private companies, but also for the nonprofits and open source folks. There's a question of trust. If it's just one person or a few people or a small board that actually controls what's going on, that's not a great way of building trust in the community. It really depends on what community you're actually serving as well. If you're serving a global community of, let's say, marginalized communities, your governance should reflect the look and shape and feel of the people you're working with. So all these things, I just mentioned a bunch of stuff and just summarizing it. There's a lot of contributors, a lot of things in the air that are bringing us to this moment where we're thinking, how do I bring together a group, a given project, and how do I help that project somehow transition to community? All right, but, okay, and this is where, for me, the fun begins. Turns out, community isn't free. Turns out the commons, not free. And to community is not a free process, nor is it easy. Turns out it's actually kind of risky and takes much longer than you think it does. That's why we're building a calculator. When I say calculator, you should really think like rent versus buy, and or any kind of calculator that helps people make a complicated decision that's going to have a big impact on their lives in the future, right? Almost every open source software project and almost every project in general, digital project in general, as we come up, is going to have to make these kinds of decisions. And there are almost no tools out there right now to help them think through, like, this is what the risks are, this is what the benefits are, and this is what the cost is going to be if you go down this long and winding road. So, yeah, and it's more specifically a transition calculator, as in, if I'm going to IPO, this is the money I can expect to make and the time and the sort of legal costs. Obviously, we don't know as much about IPO, so we're going to cite existing literature. But if you want to go through an exit to community, what is that going to cost? Put in a bunch of numbers, put in a bunch of variables, and we're going to help you sort of think through this. So these are the cases that the calculator is going to serve. As I said, and we kind of realized this in the middle of this research that there was impossible to build one calculator to serve them all. So we're really building like a bunch of different models, a bunch of different calculators to help people think through these different situations, which are very different. So in the case one, we have a typical small community, BDFL, of an open source software project. They're don't want to do it anymore, or in practice, actually a lot of what happens is they're just getting old. People are aging out of, I guess, they're entering retirement and they don't want to be maintaining this when they're like 70 or 80. So what happens there? Case two, a company wants to open source its software. So it's like things like Google, IBM, Meta, etc. How do they do that? And case three is how a company wants to actually, when they want to exit to community, what are the processes, the legal considerations, all the variables they need to consider. I'll mention case 4 and 5 here because these are not funded, but it would be awesome to do something around these lines. And I think it's close to the hearts of some of the people in this room. But if you have an open source project and you want to kind of like DAOify, want to use Web3 kinds of tools to maintain sustainability, this is a good question. And if a company wants to exit to DAO or use some sort of blockchain-based kind of sustainability question, this is another case that we would love to sort of do some work on. Finally, you can see the OpenLAC notebook at 2.community. This includes the calculators, a bunch of causal mappings that we built, worksheets for alternative financing, and a few different other projects that were still in the works in order to, as part of this larger project around how to help companies and communities, transition to better forms of community. Last thing, thank you to my co-authors, Tara Merck at CNRS, Seth Frey at C. Davis, as well as our funders, including the National Science Foundation, Ford, Sloan, and Midjar, Schmidt Futures, and Open Collective itself. All right, thank you.